I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no peace in this land until slavery is done for. John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist in the Civil War period of the United States. He pioneered a frontier in the history of abolition and freedom for black people throughout America at this time. His actions were the first of their kind, with the largest impact of anything before. Brown's legacy was and is monumental for a variety of reasons. For one, he was the first third party to come in and make action against slavery, not just educate or make legislation, but actually do something with a direct effect. This goes to show how John Brown was a huge influence of the Civil War, pioneering abolition and leading outside groups who weren't directly affected by slavery through life-risking revolts in an attempt to end it. John Brown was born in a very religious household in Connecticut. His father always had an opposing stance towards slavery. His family later moved to Ohio, in a town called Hudson that would later be known for its radical abolitionism. These environments were huge contributors to his radical abolitionist views through being raised in a community with no tolerance for the injustice of slavery, where many people in the community were actively fighting to stop it. As an adult, he moved around the country and never really achieved financial success. He had attempted many different professions, and due to poor economic conditions in the country, as well as Brown's poor businessmanship, it was hard for him to succeed at anything, even driving him to bankruptcy at one point. Although he was never wealthy, he was still actively supporting the causes important to him, raising a black child as his own and giving land to escaped slaves, as well as supporting other abolitionist causes financially to the point he was able to. He also participated in the Underground Railroad and created an organization that helped slaves escape capture. While John Brown is most heavily credited for the work of him and his family, it really was a family event, where in many cases his sons were just as vital to his success as he was himself. The first major action that got him more recognition as someone important to abolition was when he was 55 and followed his sons to the Kansas Territory. In this later part of his life, he fought against a pro-slavery attack, and he and his sons went to a pro-slavery district and murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. He and his sons fought there for the majority of that year. They were deeply involved in this time period and area referred to as Bleeding Kansas, and were very recognized for this involvement later after Brown's death. Arguably the most significant event of John Brown's life and abolitionist career was his raid on Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Choosing Harper's Ferry was actually a strategic choice because it contained a large arsenal full of weapons, and it was also somewhat of a gateway placed right between the North and South United States. With growing tensions between the North and South prior to the Civil War, Brown hoped that this raid would be able to reach both sides from one point of attack. The goal of this mission was to capture the arsenal, take up arms, and start a wave throughout the states at the time, liberating any and all slaves in one fell swoop through one giant uprising. They started out at a farm which they had rented in Maryland, fairly close in proximity to Harper's Ferry. At this farm, he and a group of 6 recognized abolitionists called the Secret Six organized with an army of 22 men. This company held 5 black men in addition to 3 of Brown's sons. In this raid, Brown and his company raided the armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, on the night of October 16, 1859. They stormed the town, liberating 5 slaves. This attempt ended poorly for the raiders. They had captured some 5 hostages and fought for 3 days before being overrun by a company of U.S. Marines. The Marines had arrived at Harper's Ferry the morning of the 17th, as word had been spreading like a wildfire. Brown and his men had been hiding out in a small barn, which barely fit all 27-ish, mostly wounded and few dead hostages and fighters. On the morning of the 19th, Brown and his army were overrun by the Marines, and Brown was captured. He was taken to court in Virginia, where he was tried for murder as well as conspiring with slaves for rebellion. Brown accepted his guilty sentence, saying that he had acted in accordance with God's will. Brown was convicted and sentenced to death on November 2nd, 1859, and was hanged exactly a month later. In the time between, there had been rumors of a rescue attempt forming, so Brown was heavily guarded by a militia between his sentence and execution. Many of Brown's supporters wrote letters to government officials, threatening something, most likely an attack if they don't pardon him. Many letters had been addressed to Henry A. Wise, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. Wise would become a Confederate general in the Civil War, and therefore obviously had a negative bias towards Brown to begin with. From a state's perspective at this time, Brown was obviously guilty, however it is now obvious that he was on the right side of history. John Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859 in Charlestown, West Virginia. A big part of John Brown's short-term legacy was the manner in which he blazed a trail of abolition that Abraham Lincoln would later follow. This essentially shows how the existence of John Brown and his activism in abolition were a large contributor towards the Civil War and larger-scale movements for abolition. One could even go as far as to say that John Brown was the single greatest cause of the Civil War. His actions created more tension between pro- and anti-slavery people, between Bleeding Kansas and the Harper's Ferry raid, as well as tension between abolitionist citizens and the government. Although the Civil War isn't exactly what John Brown had in mind, it is the most significant mark left by his protest and one of the most important parts of American history, dramatically shaping the present government and economy, as well as creating the first legislative progress towards rights for Black people. This is seen through the Civil War that led to the 13th and 14th Amendments, which are the first laws ending slavery. The 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This made slavery illegal by law. However, slavery wasn't just over as soon as the amendment was brought into place. The 14th Amendment states, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." This amendment makes it illegal from a federal level for states to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, meaning that states cannot limit rights of anybody according to the law. Despite both of these amendments, slavery still existed until 1865, when the last slaves were freed. Keeping this in mind, John Brown didn't end slavery, and he wasn't the sole cause of the Civil War. However, he was one of the greatest individual contributors to its existence, and he spent his life fighting for abolition and died for it with his sons in the end. Between his death and the 1900s, there were countless works of art about and of John Brown. There is in fact still art being made about John Brown and his life all the way up to today. Some famous works are John Brown by Peter Hansen Balling in 1872 and The Last Moments of John Brown by Thomas Hovenden in 1884. Additionally, some people celebrate John Brown Day sometime in the first week of May all the way up to May 14th in Lake Placid, New York. There are also many sites relating to John Brown's life that are now kept as historical sites, as well as the John Brown Museum in Osawatomie, Kansas. Some important sites are the one at the site of his hanging, as well as the barn in Harper's Ferry where he and his men fought after the raid. Although John Brown did all he could and was a powerful and meaningful protester, regardless of law, Black people are still oppressed and treated unjustly by the state. This is now in less direct ways than the institution of slavery, but the problem still exists and is highly prominent in modern society. A final example of John Brown's influence on artwork and culture is the song John Brown's Body, which became the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was sung by Northern soldiers in the Civil War. It was a powerful song and piece of culture in this time, which came to be because of Brown and his actions and the change they created.
He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true. He frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hanged him for a traitor, they themselves the traitor crew. His soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
In conclusion, John Brown was an instrumental component to the start of the Civil War, the Abolitionist movement, and the fight for freedom of Black people in pre-industrial and industrializing America. His actions were the first of their kind, being the first white third party using his power in society to fight for others' justice and freedom. John Brown pioneered the frontier of rights for Black people, and although his actions didn't have an immediate effect in the way he intended, they were a hard push towards an event that did have the effect he was looking for. He risked his life and the lives of many of his sons for an important cause which ultimately didn't affect him, and in the end he accepted his loss of the battle and didn't live to see the winning of the war. While the war isn't over, with Black people still facing injustice in America, the institution of slavery is gone, which is an indicator of John Brown's success pioneering the frontier of abolition.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.